Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video we're going to be talking about one of the most hyped up unit and a unit that many people are claiming is a must pull, and that unit is Silverwolf. Now the interesting thing about Silverwolf is that she actually hasn't been available to test for quite some time. She was not in closed beta 3, and as a result of that, no one really has played her in the endgame that we're expected to get for release. If you guys didn't know, there was a massive overhaul to the endgame between closed beta 2 and closed beta 3, and Silverwolf was only available in closed beta 2. In addition to that, a lot of units had their values changed, and there was a full rebalance of every character's stats. So it's entirely possible and very, very likely the numbers that we're about to talk about are completely going to change. But I think that the mechanics behind it are probably going to be pretty similar, and consider this video entertainment, and make sure that you don't take through things too seriously. Okay, so what's the point of this video then? If you don't have any hard numbers, if you don't have any sort of things which are going to be solid, why are you making this video? Well, there are a lot of people who are saving their free-to-play currency indefinitely for Silverwolf's release under the assumption that she is going to be a meta-defining unit and a game-breaking one at that. Now, I figure this is actually a pretty interesting topic, and I'm going to apply my theory crafting hat here to kind of take a bit of a look and see how true that is, and we're going to kind of break down her abilities based on what we see in, closed beta 2 and a bit of closed beta 3 stuff based on the tutorial, and we can kind of see, okay, how high is her potential? Is she really going to be this game breaking? And what's the kind of stuff that she's got on the table here? I'm going to be trying as objective as possible. Obviously, I don't have any hard numbers. I can't tell you exactly how much she's going to multiply everyone's damage or anything like that, but I can give you kind of my opinion, and maybe that's entertaining. Let's get into it though. So first and foremost, Silverwolf. She is going to primarily probably be played as a supporting character, and she is of the quantum variety, which is, at launch at least, a very rare element. In addition to that, the quantum element is a controlling element, not a DPS element. Now, I believe that the controlling elements of imaginary and quantum are going to be far more valuable in the endgame than the damaging variety, as damage can be scaled but control cannot. Control is part of a character's kit. So you essentially get a mega stun when you break with quantum, imaginary, or ice, making them very, very good in the endgame when you're trying to stop an enemy from hitting you to extend your ability to kind of manipulate the field of battle. So already she's now a support with a quantum kind of typing there, which is probably the best typing for a support. Okay, now I've mentioned here that she's going to be played as support. What does that mean? Well, most likely Silver will be played as a basic attack spamming support, which uses her skill fairly rarely, kind of on a reasonably long timer. And that is basically going to allow her to generate skill points for the rest of the team. And I'm happy to say that most of her kit pretty much revolves around supporting that, and she can do most of her job without having to spend too many skill points at all, which means she is going to be able to be paired with most of the other characters in the game, making her an incredibly universal unit, which you can pretty much bring on any single team, and she's just going to make it better. She can fuel pretty much most of the carries in the game, and she's going to be pretty solid. So already, if you were looking for a unit to consider pulling, which was long-term and future-proof, she's already a reasonably good candidate, purely from being a well-typed supporting unit who builds skill points, which is pretty damn good. Now, when we get into her base stats here, the only one we care about is speed. Supports only care about speed, as that is what dictates how many skill points they generate and how many times they can interact with the enemy. And her speed is above average, which is pretty good. 107, that's pretty good. You can multiply that out as well with other things, so it's going to be pretty nice. And I think that, overall she's got a pretty good set of stats. So far, so good. She's looking pretty strong. Now, what does she bring to the table, though? Well, Silverwolf is a debuffing nihility character, so she's all about lowering the abilities of the enemy. How does she do that? Well, it's with her talent bugs. She basically is going to apply 3 separate debuffs that she can do randomly. Now, what these bugs do is as follows. They are a debuff that you can apply to enemies, which lasts 3 turns. So you can apply the bug, after 3 turns the enemy takes, it will expire. Now, the 3 varieties of these bugs are an attack reduction, a defense reduction, and a speed reduction. And the way that you apply these is using her basic attack, as well as a few other ways which we'll get into in a second here. But first and foremost, let's talk about how good these bugs are. So reducing an enemy's attack by 20% is exceptionally powerful. It's essentially a 20% damage reduction, that's nothing to scoff at. Overall, I think that's really, really strong, and in really, really dangerous scenarios, that's going to make the difference. Next up, we have a damaging portion here, which is going to reduce the enemy's defense by 20%. This is the most powerful offensive stat to stack, as the more of it you stack on an enemy, the more damage you get. So the first 20% is only going to get better the more you get. So 20, 20, 20, 20, the third 20% is going to be even better than the first one or the second one. So if you can get as much defense penetration as possible, up to 100%, that's going to be ideal. If you take an enemy which has 50% damage reduction because of their armor or their defense, and you shred all 100% of it, you're going to be dealing double damage. And in the end game, enemies have more than 50% damage reduction. So if you have an enemy which has 60 or 70% damage reduction and you remove all of that damage reduction, you can start to see how this gets really out of control really quick. So damage definitely is going to be really boosted by this damage, this defense reduction here, which is really nice. Next up, and finally, the last bug here is a speed reduction, which is, I can't even describe how powerful that will be, and I will probably talk a little bit about it a little bit later when we get to the teams, which will probably be pretty good at. But fair to say, it's really powerful to lower an enemy's speed. So overall, we've already got 3 debuffs, all of which are incredibly powerful, and they're very good if you can get all 3 on the target. So how do you apply these? Well, it's using her basic attack, and that's really crazy because it means she can do her entire job of applying these debuffs while generating skill points. There's very few units in the game who can do their job effectively and 100% without having to use skill points, meaning she is a premium unit for that reason. So it states that whenever she uses a basic attack, she has a 65% chance to implant a random bug, and that's the bugs we just talked about: attack, defense, or speed reductions. Now, only 65% chance, which means on average she'll probably need like 5 or 6 turns in the perfect world to apply all 3, and they only last 3 turns, so that's not acceptable. How do we fix that? Well, there is only one way to fix that, and that is with effect hit rate. It's a stat which you can stack on characters, and I imagine that most people playing Silverwolf are going to basically stack effect hit rate out the wazoo, and that's essentially going to leave no room for any damaging stats. So basically in the rest of this video, we're going to completely ignore anything which mentions damage, because she's probably going to be built as speed and effect hit rate pretty much exclusively. All of her stats will go into that, and everything will be focusing on that. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. So if you have effect hit rate, how does it work? Well, you have a 65% base chance. If you add 100% effect hit rate, it would multiply that base chance by 100%, and our current understanding is that that would then become a 130% base chance, which would exceed 100%, and it would basically just be a guarantee. Now, there is also a stat which enemies can have called effect hit resistance, and it's basically the opposite. If an enemy has 50% effect hit resistance, and you got a 130% chance to hit, well, now you're going to go back down to 65. So that's not so great, and that's kind of how we currently understand that it works. So you really don't want to deal with effect hit resistance on enemies, and that will really diminish her value. So we can already see here that while she is incredibly powerful when she gets to play the way she wants to, there are going to be enemies which potentially could screw her up. However, that is solved with her Eidolons, which we'll get into, which are pretty busted as well. Okay, so very good that we can apply our bugs there, but you're still going to need, even at a 100% chance to hit, 3 turns to ramp that up. So is that good? Well, that's not bad. The defenses and all that stuff is very strong, but 3 turns, that's a long time, man. So what can we do to fix that? Well, she actually has some traces which do actually fix just that. Her first trace here essentially gives you a 55% chance to plant an additional bug, which, with enough effect hit rate, which you're going to be building out the wazoo, you will be able to plant 2 bugs most of the time, randomly. And because you're now implanting 2, the variance and the kind of like chance to get bad RNG is now lower, and most of the time you're going to be, kind of fully ramping on a boss in 2 turns, most of the time, unless you get pretty unlucky. So you got a 2-turn ramp time on getting all the debuffs on that boss, and that's pretty good. Overall, you're going to be getting the majority in the first one, and then you're going to get that final bit in the second one, which is pretty good. In addition to that, there is also a bit of a chance here for enemies who attack her to implant a random bug as well, which is pretty nice. You can obviously, get a few bugs everywhere here and there, especially in AoE, which is where Silverwolf really struggles, which we'll talk about. That is a very nice trace to have. Okay, pretty good there. And now we fully understand her basic attack and her talent here. She's essentially going to have pretty much 100% uptime, the attack, the speed, and the defense down in a single target scenario. We'll talk about that more in a second here. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about here is her skill. We already fully understand that Silverwolf already is a great basic attack and skill point generator who offers pretty good utility already in just the stuff she provides. It's incredibly powerful. Now, when we get to her skill though, this is where people kind of go crazy. They kind of lose their mind, and then they suddenly label Silverwolf as a must pull. So they're not entirely wrong. I'm sorry to say, or happy to say, this is a potentially game warping skill. The way that it currently reads and the way that it looks like it functions in closed beta 2 is exceptionally crazy. It definitely feels like a skill which could definitely be, every single team kind of wants to kind of consider building around. I don't want to overstate it too much, but it definitely does seem like that kind of a skill. Obviously nothing in the game is balanced around having any of these 5 stars. I'm pretty sure that you can probably complete the Forgotten Hall, at least with what we know so far with 4 stars exclusively. But you know, this unit is going to be a lot of fun to consider, to theory craft around, and also build around. So that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on here. How powerful is it to build around and to theory craft around? Let's get started. Okay, so what does this ability do? Well, it's essentially going to add a weakness type to an enemy based on one of the members in your team, and it's going to pick randomly. So if you wanted to use this skill and you had 4 quantum units in your team and the enemy was not weak to quantum, you use the skill, bam, they're now going to be weak to quantum for 3 turns, and that is exceptionally powerful. Now if you had a 2 quantum and 2 fire team, well, it would choose 50-50 between the two, and you'd have a 50% chance at fire and 50% quantum. If you had 4 different elements, well, now it's really going to be all crazy and all over the place in terms of RNG and chance. So this is going to encourage a new way to build teams, and that is incredibly exciting. You could either build pure quantum, you could build 2 and 2, you could, you know, kind of go wherever you want. 3 quantum, 1 other, you know, there's a lot of different potential here, and it really opens up the possibility of a lot of cool theory crafting, which makes me very excited and makes it so that I want to pull this unit for myself just purely from this fact alone. All right, okay, so quantum weakness or any weakness, how powerful is that? Well, that is a very good question. So first we need to understand resistances. So in the game, when an enemy is vulnerable to a resistance, you know, like vulnerable to fire, vulnerable to ice, anything like that, they generally have 0 resistance to that element. Now, resistance is essentially a stat that enemies can have. If they have 50% resistance, they're going to resist half your damage. If they have 0% resistance, you're going to do full damage to them in terms of their elemental damage. Now, this is different to defense. Defense is a flat mitigation across the board. Resistance is a separate thing that enemies can have, which is going to mitigate a specific element. And this is basically what we're going to be talking about here. Now, if we apply a vulnerability to an enemy, which is neutral though, those enemies already have 20% resistance to all elements, generally, apart from the ones they're vulnerable to. So a neutral enemy, 20% resistance. A vulnerable enemy, 0% resistance to the element that they are actually neutral or vulnerable to. When we get to a resistant enemy, they generally have 40 to 60% resistance of an element. So if you have an enemy which is resistant to ice, like a big ice golem, it's going to have 40 to 60% elemental resistance to ice. Now, why is this important? Well, let's imagine a world in which you're up against a quantum golem, whoa, and it has resistance to quantum, and then you've got your mono quantum team, oh boy, and then you use the Silver Wolf skill on that enemy and you make them vulnerable to quantum. They will still have the quantum resistance, so they will still have that 60% quantum resistance because they are resistant to quantum. If you use this against a neutral enemy, they'll probably still have that 20% neutral resistance to the element that you are making it vulnerable to. So overall, while this is pretty crazy, it's probably most powerful when used against neutral enemies with our current understanding. Now, if there's a world in which this weakness that you apply just immediately sets the resistance to 0 as if it was naturally weak to that element, we're talking like a completely different unit here. That would be completely broken. But I'm pretty sure that it will just apply the mechanical weakness, which essentially is going to allow you to interact with the toughness bar with the element which you have made it weak to, which is very strong. We'll get into that, but it's not game breaking yet. So that is pretty important to note. So if you use this on an enemy which is neutral, you're still going to have to deal with that 20% resistance. And if you use this on an enemy which is resistant to the element, well, you're still going to have to deal with that 40 or 60% damage reduction there. And the real question though is going to be what happens when you use this on an enemy which is already vulnerable to quantum or vulnerable to the element which you are setting it to. That is very interesting. And that is particularly interesting when we get to the next part here. So this is going to follow up with what we were just talking about here. It says that you reduce the enemy's damage resistance to that attack by 20%. So that attack type insinuates that it's going to be to quantum or to fire or whatever you're lowering or making them vulnerable to. So the way I read this is that it's going to lower the resistances. So let's take our example from earlier. Let's say that you have a neutral enemy which is 20% resistance to quantum, which is what you're going to make it weak to. You would reduce that down to 0, which would make a whole lot of sense. And if they were resistant to quantum and that 40 to 60, it would go down to 20 to 40. Now this is very good, and that's the way I'm reading it. You know, overall that will solve that problem a little bit, but it's still not going to be as good as just bringing a unit which is correct elemental typing to the fight. It's not going to be crazy. You're still going to get a damage reduction as a result of doing this the way that we're doing it and kind of forcing a team, like kind of forcing a square peg through a circle hole. You know, just because you're doing that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Now, the question which I really have though is if you use this skill on an enemy which is already vulnerable to like quantum and it's got that 0% resistance, does the resistance go negative? If you make it vulnerable twice to quantum, will the penetration from the skill still apply? I don't know. I haven't tested it. I would love to, but that really is going to dictate how flexible and how powerful this unit is in all scenarios. She's either going to be used probably predominantly on neutral units to kind of make your team, you know, effective against that unit, or in very niche cases against super resistant units where you kind of just want to brute force a team comp if you want to kind of go down that route. But overall, this skill, it's like a bit of a black box. It could potentially be game breaking, but it could also potentially be, you know, just like, you know, good. Now, I do want to say one thing. This is pretty interesting in that it actually can make you able to make enemies vulnerable to elements which they shouldn't be able to. And the one that I really want to draw your attention to is the quantum type we talked about earlier. Quantum is a crowd control element. And when you break an enemy for quantum damage, they actually have their action deload. They are basically slowed by quite a significant amount. So I imagine in teams where you want to control the enemy, just making them vulnerable to imaginary or quantum and then breaking them with that, when they should not otherwise be able to be broken by that, is incredibly powerful. And, you know, overall, they're going to probably be seeing quite a few abusive cases with this, even if the damage resistance is kind of like not as much of a damage multiplier as we think. Overall, I think that this skill is going to be game defining, is going to be team defining and account defining, and allow you to do things which other players cannot do who do not have Silver Wolf. Now, is that necessarily a must pull? Well, I'll leave that up to you guys. All right, so next up, we're going to go with the ultimate. So the only thing you guys need to know about the ultimate, because the rest of it's damage related, is that it inflicts the quantum weakness break effect, guaranteed straight up on demand. You can see here that it says when entangled, which is the quantum effect, the enemy action is delayed by 40%. And essentially, it's an on-demand delay on a single target. Now, that is exceptionally powerful. You know, obviously, you can basically on-demand skip half of someone's turn. If someone is about to go and you're worried about it, bam, just, you know, Silver Wolf ultimate them and their turn is going back. Now, this is particularly powerful when stacked favorably with another ultimate that does the same thing, like Welt, or with a weakness break with quantum. You can start to see how these things will stack up crazily, and you will probably very quickly get into a scenario in which you can perma-stun an enemy which is not very quick. Now, how do you make it so an enemy is not very quick? Well, you slow them. Well, she has that too. Who else has a slow? Welt, who also has his ultimate which does the same thing. And there's also other characters like Dan Heng, who is a damage character who can play alongside both of those, who also has a slow. So you can see here how it's probably going to be a pretty crazy character to have in terms of long-term for your account if you're interested in the controlling playstyle. Now, let's talk a little bit about her single target potential here, because that is really where this character is going to be a little bit, you know, maybe not as powerful as I think a lot of people think. So in an area where there is one enemy, I would say that she is probably one of, if not the best supports currently that I have seen in the game in terms of the way that her mechanics work. And she also has the most scaling potential, as she can be stacked with other defense shreds, she can be stacked with other slows, other delays, other pretty much everything. She just works everywhere, and it's kind of crazy. She can also be having whole metas built around her due to the quantum stuff, and, you know, it's crazy, man. But when it comes to AoE, when there is 3, 4, 5 targets, well, now we're got a bit of an interesting discussion, because her whole entire rotation works around debuffing one singular enemy for the most part. And, you know, she has a ramp up time on that as well. To get all 3 of the bugs on a target, it's probably 2 turns minimum. And then she also has the weakness, which is going to have to use on one enemy. Now, the weakness infliction here, the vulnerability, conflicts with stacking the bugs. If you're stacking the bugs, you're not applying the skill, the vulnerability. If you're applying the vulnerability, you know, if you're doing the bugs, you're not applying the vulnerability. You know, either one. You have to choose between what you're going to do. You're going to go bugs, or you're going to go vulnerability. And that means it really does feel like you have quite a ramp up time on this character, meaning multiple targets probably isn't going to be as favorable for her. She does have a little bit of interaction with AoE with her antivirus trace, which allows her to apply bugs randomly on targets that attack her. So it might be an idea to put her like next to the tank, or, you know, with March's shield on her potentially, you know, but, you know, overall it feels like she doesn't really have a lot of options in AoE, and her ultimate doesn't help with that either. It's going to be a single target slow, so it feels like Silver Wolf really was designed to like basically deal and basically trivialize big single target fights. If you bring Silver Wolf to a big single target fight, I can't see a world in which she doesn't completely trivialize it. It is pretty crazy. But in an AoE scenario, I think that there probably is better supports than Silver Wolf, just purely from the facts that I just mentioned. Now, overall, we're going to talk a little bit more about her potential here in a second here, but I do want to quickly talk about her Eidolons, because some of them do kind of solve quite a lot of her problems, you know, so, you know, we'll talk a little bit about them. So first and foremost, the effect resistance kind of talk and discussion there. We did mention that, you know, effect resistance on the enemy could potentially disrupt what Silver Wolf is trying to do, and, you know, there could be fights where an enemy has like 50% effect resistance, and that really makes her a lot more difficult to use. Her Eidolon 2 just fixes that. It lowers the enemy effect resistance for 2 turns on entry, and, you you know, pretty much after 2 turns, you can already kind of deal with many things that are going on in a fight. You're going to be able to get that vulnerability. You're going to be able to get the bugs on there. And, you know, you're kind of going to be sticking in that fight and dealing with most of what the edge of the enemy has. You know, so that's going to be pretty good there. You know, not too bad there. And then her ultimate, her Eidolon 4 also makes it so that if the enemy has debuffs on there, specifically up to a cap of 5, she can regenerate up to 40 energy after using her ultimate. So baseline units generate 5 energy after they're using their ultimate, and then her Eidolon 4 is going to give her an additional 40, which is essentially going to make her ultimate effectively a cost of 75, which drastically changes her rotation and makes it so that she can use her ultimate far more frequently. And in the scenario in which you want to perma-stun an enemy, that just makes her ultimate even better. So, you know, if you want to go down that route, Eidolon 4 is certainly going to help with that, of course. You know, so that's probably where I'd stop on the Eidolons. If you really want to, like, you know, go hard on Silverwolf and you're like, this is the best unit ever, I'm never replacing this, you know, Eidolon 4 is where she becomes the absolute monster. You know, not saying that she's not good at Eidolon 0. I think she's actually probably one of the better units and one of the best units at Eidolon 0. And if I was going to pull for her, I would probably pull her for Eidolon 0 myself, as, you know, I don't really see the necessary, you know, kind of, I think this is overkill. I feel like you can, you know, pretty much trivialize all single target fights, which I've seen in the game right now, without needing Eidolon 4. So what else is there? Well, there's plenty of other stuff here. I could talk like 40 minutes, 50 minutes about Silverwolf. So let's take a little bit look at her relics though. So we've talked about these teams which you can create, which you can manipulate with Silverwolf. You can create pure elemental teams of like one type and then, you know, get the enemy to be vulnerable to them, and that's incredibly powerful. Well, that synergizes fantastically with the quantum set on relics. So the quantum set here on relics states that when the wearer attacks the enemy with quantum weakness, which is generally not most enemies aren't weak to quantum, so it's a pretty niche set, not very good, you can ignore 25% of defense, which is exceptionally powerful. Now with Silverwolf, you can apply that quantum weakness consistently if you use a pure quantum team. People are calling it mono quantum, and, you know, that is pretty cool. Now, why is it so powerful? Well, we've already talked about that because we've said that this defense shred actually stacks almost multiplicatively. The closer and closer you get to 100% defense shred, the better and better it becomes. And now you suddenly get 25% on your main carry or whoever you're putting that set on. So 25% plus the 20% on Silver, that's 45% now. You know, use Pella, okay, well, that's another 42% there. You're getting very close to 100 very, very quickly. You know, who knows what else is coming down the line. You know, there could be other units that come out which also apply the shred or other relic sets or light cones. So, you know, we're obviously seeing the amount of potential for Silverwolf is absolutely off the scale. Now, let's answer the question, is she a must pull? Well, I don't think any unit is a must pull in this game. She's probably as close as it gets to in terms of coolness factor and uniqueness and ability to build very cool teams around, because she's the only character who really does allow you to ignore the elemental mechanic in the game and really just build like mono quantum. Like, that is incredibly cool and very unique. But in terms of like needing her to complete any content, I don't think it's likely that she's going to be required unless we see new and additional game modes which are incredibly challenging added to the game. Overall, she's very cool. I think she's very, very unique and very cool. But I think where I'm going to leave this is that if you enjoy the idea of the theory crafting behind her, if you enjoy the design of the character, and if you enjoy control focused playstyles and the thought that you could completely permanently stun one target indefinitely, Silverwolf probably is a character you might want to entertain saving for and skipping the first 2 banners for. However, having said that, her numbers, her mechanics, everything could completely change. There's also quite a few question marks around this skill. So you're definitely going to have to consider that. There also does seem to be quite a lot of other characters coming down the pipe who seem exceptionally powerful as well, namely Blade, Kafka, and I'm sure Fushuan will be insane as well as a preservation character that is 5-star. She looks pretty unique already by the design. So I think that there is a lot of potential for other characters. So even if you did save for Silverwolf theoretically and someone else came along who was completely busted, I don't think you'd feel too bad. The first 2 characters, I don't think either of them are must pulls, and Jing's banner is pretty much only there because I think you'd want to get the 4 stars. He's good, Seal is good, but I think that if you were going to save, Silverwolf or another supporting unit would be a pretty good choice. If you guys enjoyed the video and you like the theory crafting discussion and find it entertaining, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more, and until next time, hope you guys enjoyed. Cheers.